Welcome back, everyone. I am Cass Piancey. I'm joined as usual by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing well, Cass. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's early for me, so I've got a nice cup of coffee here. Today, we're joined by a good friend of the podcast and formerly, still the richest man in the world. You might not have heard of him for some reason, but Colin Platt. What a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing very well. It is not early here, but I haven't started on the beer yet. So.
Well, this is coffee, just so everyone knows. I'm not getting totally wasted yet.
We've got the brief window here between when Cass starts drinking coffee and before Colin starts drinking beer that we can get this podcast recorded.
We do have a 9-hour time change between us, though.
I guess I could throw some whiskey in here, but we're just gonna move on. Anyway, in case anyone is unfamiliar with why I say Colin Platt is arguably the richest man in the world, Colin, can you explain PTK to everybody?
Yeah, so in 2018, I and a bunch of guys got together at this conference in Seoul, South Korea. We showed up early to the conference, and we were at the hotel where it was going to take place, and this was right after kind of the top of crypto in 2017. I think it was like April 2018. So things were just coming down, but there was still this kind of feeling of, it could all come back. And a lot of us kind of had seen the good and the bad, and there was a lot of bad in 2017. There's no hiding that. And we said, well, there's enough of us around the table. We're going to be at this conference the next couple of days. Like, let's just make our own stupid token and like sell it to ourselves. And so we came up with just like the worst idea of a white paper, just, whatever word salad we could throw together. And I think it was like a gray paper, and we made text that was like light gray over dark gray. And it was just, the whole thing was horrible. And then all of us speaking at the conference just started dropping this in. Like on every panel we were in, I was the chief pseudoscientist. We had somebody that was developer advocacy. There was no development. Like, we just made the whole thing up. And after the conference, and during the conference actually, we had a bunch of people coming up and actually asking us to invest into this project, and people wanting to credibly put in sizable chunks of money. And it went on for a couple of months. So the following year, same conference again in Seoul, South Korea in 2019, we decided that like I was going to get up and give a presentation about this. And it was in this giant stadium. Like, I think it was the main stadium in Seoul, and thousands of people there, including people from the government. And I got up and gave this speech about how great PTK was. And the basic idea of PTK is you could never sell it for less than it was sold previously. So the number can only go up. So best cryptocurrency ever. This was well before, Ohm or Ichi or any of these great things that we've seen, which basically tried to build this for real. And I gave this whole speech. One of the slides, it was, the value of PTK. And I'll come back into it. But it was basically $3.6 quadrillion. And that is 3 times the value of all of the money in the world. Or it was at the time. I'm sure it's much, much less because of all the money printing or whatever Bitcoiners tell us happened. So maybe only 2 times now. But basically, it was this giant picture of this orange blob that was the PTK logo overshadowing the earth. And at the end, I said this whole thing is a joke, and I got a bunch of nasty tweets from people in the South Korean government that were in attendance about how this is so horrible, but it was a lot of fun. It wasn't just doing a presentation. Like, I actually launched this token and wash traded it with myself on a DEX that predated Uniswap, and actually traded it up to this valuation. It's just like every time I trade it, I'd only trade it higher. And I wrote a whole blog post about this. It got covered in the Financial Times. It got covered in the Block. It got covered in a bunch of things. And it was just a really good joke. And it showed how ridiculous a lot of the industry was, particularly in 2017 and 2018, about these fantastic valuations. And in actual fact, it was all just people trading amongst each other, people trading very small amounts and massively inflating. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen still, but the industry has changed a bit. But it was just pointing out where we stood in 2018, 2019 in the industry. And I'd say since then, I'm with you guys. I'm still very critical about a lot of things, but I think a lot of things have improved and have moved on. And thankfully, we have less 2017 style ICOs. We have lots of other things that we can critique, but at least it's a new scam that we're running now.
Well, I think it's good that you explained much of this, but I do think there's another point that you didn't go into detail in, and I think a lot of our audience, it would help them to understand how this made you exactly the richest person. But you alluded to it just now, which is that you were wash trading this token. For anyone who's unaware, wash trading is basically selling and buying an asset to yourself, right? There's no other parties involved. You're just selling it to increase the volume and apparently the price as well, sometimes if you want to, I guess. But if you could explain how that mechanism works.
Yeah, so obviously this is much more widely known with Uniswap kind of being very prevalent, and I assume most people know what Uniswap is. If they don't, it's a automated market maker. It's somewhat like a decentralized exchange, but you have to have liquidity on both sides. So you put in made up token and let's say Tether, because I know that's popular here. And I put in $5 of Tether on one side and then 5 of my made up tokens. That means that my token is now worth $1 each, and there's $10 of liquidity in total. If I go in and I add one more Tether in there, well, now there's 6 versus 5, so the price has gone up. You can keep doing these things on very, very small amounts. Now, I talked about 5 of my tokens and 5 Tether or 6 Tether in here. I may happen to have another quintillion tokens out here. And if I'm marking them all against this price, that means what started out with just 5 Tether and 5 of my tokens, so a $5 investment, quote unquote, I've now printed a quintillion tokens at that $1 valuation each. So there's no real backing, there's no market. If I was ever going to try to sell this with a third party, like if I tried to sell it to Cass, he would probably very rightfully give me 0. We're very close to 0 because, it has some intrinsic value of being funny. But that's kind of it. There's no notion that this should be really worth $1 a token. It's just how it sits inside these. Because it's all decentralized and the exchange I was using at the time that predated Uniswap again, there's no checks and balances of who can put it in. Anybody could just create a pair, trade a pair. I could just go in with another account and trade against myself. There's no notion like what you would see inside of a regulated exchange of saying, well, A, you can't trade with yourself. B, we need to know who you are before you can trade. And C, we need to do some checks before we even put this thing on. So even in the exchanges that probably get the most critique on this podcast, there is some kind of processing to make sure that, the token we're trading on isn't a token I just made up 30 seconds ago. The people trading on this, well, they have some money in this account, and there is some balance between how much is actually trading in existence and this value that's reported. It does screw up sometimes, and we see these things show up on CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko or whatever else, where a token will momentarily exceed the market cap of Bitcoin. So it's always good when the algorithms screw up and you see people trying to do the same thing.
PTK was a really good exemplar of how a lot of the easy metrics in crypto are really easy to manipulate. Like clearly in this case, market cap, where there was such a small float inflated by such a small number of parties. Clearly, PTK is not representative of the broader cryptocurrency market, but there are many cryptocurrencies with quite a small float compared to their total supply being traded in relatively illiquid places. And you hear people discuss the dollar values of the market cap as though it's actual money. And I think PTK is a good reminder that this paper wealth, this illiquid wealth, is meaningfully different. You need someone on the other side of the trade to get any real value out of it. And as an aside, even before Ohm and some of those newer projects, back in 2018 and 2019, there were also ICO projects that were promising that their price could only go up. Their price would be buoyed ever upward. And I actually got a cease and desist letter from one of them. So those claims have persisted.
I'm wondering, Colin, as somebody who's you're obviously involved in cryptocurrency, you trade, you do things regularly. I think you understood at that time when you created PTK that wash trading was a real issue. And I think, when we've previously talked about for instance, Tether, I think a big issue that people would talk about was wash trading and how much of the volume of Tether in general was just wash trading. Do you think that's changed a lot? Do you think there's a significant difference now than, for instance, 2018? And if so, what is the new wash trading? What is the new problem that is comparable to that?
Yeah, so let me break that down because there's quite a bit in there. So do I think things have changed? Yes and no. I think things have definitely changed more in certain venues. It's a basic fact there is more regulation for everything cryptocurrency and in particular exchanges. I say everything cryptocurrency. I'm going to leave DeFi things off to the side just for a moment. Everything that really existed in 2017, now, if it still exists, is more regulated. So things like centralized exchanges, most all of them have at least some kind of basic KYC. Sometimes it only kicks in at a certain threshold. It's generally come down. In 2017, a lot of that didn't exist. There was, Binance very famously was a no KYC exchange up until the middle of last year, if I'm not incorrect. It may have even been in early 2022. But lots of these things have made I guess, democratize wash trading really kind of a thing of the past, just because it is a higher threshold to have to go in and set up 5 accounts that I set up, I send in, I do the KYC process. Sometimes that takes a couple of days, a couple of weeks. I can't trade with myself as I could before, where I could just go spin that up with an API and have 100 different exchanges, plug all those into some kind of AWS bot and run all those things through. It is harder. Now, does wash trading still exist in those venues? Absolutely. And some of those venues even encourage wash trading, particularly to projects. So it is still an industry. It does still exist.
When you say that projects can be like incentivized to wash trade, can you explain why you say that?
Yeah. So with exchanges that list tokens, generally they have metrics set up. So there is a contract when they list a token for any type of token outside of the largest one. So generally there wouldn't be a contract for Bitcoin, Ethereum, because they're just so large. They need to process those. Generally, a lot of the big stable coins, USDT, USDC, similar circumstance, they need them. So they wouldn't necessarily go to Tether and say, hey, we'll list you, because Tether would just say, well, you use this, or they don't. USDC, similar at this point. They're just so big that exchanges need to use them. Now, I'm not going to get into all the arguments right away on all those, but you need a stable coin or a dollar or some kind of fiat thing, which means you need to have a bank account, which all exchanges do. So they'll just let those things through. Now, anything smaller than that, and we'll take even the bigger ends, things like XRP. XRP will actually go out and they'll talk to the exchanges. And this was actually quite widely broadcast that some of the exchanges, including Coinbase, took a long time to list them. There were things that got leaked out that they were paying to get onto different exchanges, including Coinbase. And this is very well known inside the industry. There are fees and payments to get any token on, even very popular tokens. Now they have a sliding scale depending on how popular your token is of what it costs to actually get listed, and different exchanges charge different prices based on this. But when you do this, there is a contract, and in that contract it says things like you need to have volume, you need to have different metrics. The team can't, just run away and scam, otherwise we'll delist you, and things like this. Things that you would expect to see when something's admitted for trading, not dissimilar from what you would want to see at, New York Stock Exchange or someplace like that. All of these things I would say are generally good practices. Now, inside some of those things, they do have metrics that, let's say, work better if it is a very widely traded asset. Having minimum volumes. We only want to list tokens that trade over $1 million a day or $10 million a day, depending on the exchange. Things like this. Not horrible ideas. Now, that works very well in the traditional industry where you have market makers that do these things. Lots of market makers are actually paid to trade with themselves and trade with each other. So it's not something that is unique to the crypto industry. And I wouldn't even say that it's quote unquote bad by itself to show that there's some volume in there. Now, what they do, however, is because they have these very tight things on otherwise very liquid assets, what that means is you have very, very high relative to real external organic volume, very high just internal trades happening in some of these things. And if you sit there and watch an order book, you can see these things happening, especially if you get out of the top, 50 to 100 tokens by market cap or by volume or whatever metric you want to use, and start looking down to, 101 to 1,000 that's listed. And if you look at some of these exchanges, because I talked about a listing coming kind of from the token project to be listed, you also have a lot of these exchanges that are very well known to just unilaterally do their own listing. And often this is a project that gets very popular kind of overnight, and they just decide to list it. When Dogecoin got very popular and not very many exchanges had listed it, they went out and they started trying to list this thing and trying to figure out how to do it. And they didn't know who to contact because, the original founder of Doge just kind of took off. So there are exchanges that go out and unilaterally do it, and they do it often in very small tokens. And they do run their own wash trading in some of these cases to show there's some kind of volume because they know they get business out of this. If a new token comes up on Uniswap, is the top 3 volume on Uniswap for 3 days, they want to be the first exchange to go in there because they know they're going to make a few $100,000 on fees. So wash trading does happen. It can happen either because the project is incentivized to do it by the exchange, it can happen because the exchange is incentivized to do it, or it can happen because somebody is trying to incentivize other people to come trade on it. And they may have no relation to the exchange, they may have no relation to the project. They just know that if there is more trading volume, it's going to cost them a little bit of money and fees to the exchange, but that's going to make their token look more investable. So does it happen? Yes, absolutely. Some exchanges actively try to minimize that and only push towards organic volume. And even some of the exchanges that get criticized for not being necessarily the best exchanges from a regulatory point of view are ones that are very actively cracking down on that type of thing. So does it still happen? Yes, absolutely. and it's driven by different parties depending on what we're talking about.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think the part of the dynamic that you pointed to there that I've heard about that is perhaps the most common reason and perhaps most troubling reason for the wash trading is that you'll have token teams who've conducted an ICO or an IDO or an IEO or however you distribute tokens nowadays will then want to get it listed, and as a requirement for that, the exchanges will often direct them to market makers who will effectively agree to wash trade them up to a certain amount of volume. And like that's a pretty common phenomena.
It is. It's slightly different than that. So from what I understand and how it happens, so there are legitimate market makers out there. These are big entities that are very well known in the industry, and there's a bunch of different ways that they run. They're not necessarily the ones doing the wash trading. Often the wash trading will be done by a smaller, less known entity, and not necessarily, they may be trading against the market maker. They may be a quasi market maker, but this is very different from, if we talk about Alameda or Wintermute are two very well known names. Generally, these tend to be very small shops of people set up in, small countries that are just doing this and saying, I will trade, $500,000 in volume a day, and I'll go and do it very small size, and I've got a little bot that runs. That's kind of how they do that thing.
Yeah, it's just one of those troubling incentive issues because it makes sense why the exchange wants them to have a certain visual amount of volume, and it makes sense why the token wants to get listed, and it makes sense why this firm is willing to do that trading for a fee. So for each individual involved in the transaction, everything looks like it makes sense, but the net result is everyone sees a number that is inauthentic.
Well, inauthentic. These are actual numbers that are trading. It's not the exchange making up the numbers, but it is not organic order flow coming because people want to buy and sell this. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You've spent some time in traditional markets as well, right, Colin? So yeah. I guess I'm wondering, do you think that this is something that has been mostly mitigated in traditional markets, or is this something that happens in traditional markets as well?
Well, that's a really wide thing. I mean, there's definitely different forms of trading that is not coming from organic, let's say, client-driven flow. And what I mean by that is, I call it my broker, and I say buy, 100 shares of Twitter. I'm just going to say Twitter because Twitter's the thing we're talking about today, because Elon Musk is trying to buy it. I want to go buy them. That would be considered organic flow. I am an investor. I want to purchase 100 shares of Twitter. That goes through a broker. That broker, depending on the setup, will either go directly to the market for a larger broker, or if it's a smaller broker, it may go through a couple of stages, and it's different in different markets. There are different market makers that are trading with themselves for a variety of different reasons. They could be managing their book and their risk. They could be managing a derivative position that may have organic flow behind it. They could be managing the bank's prop positions, so that has been cut back quite dramatically, depending on the market again. Or they could be managing some other smaller things. Now, exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange or anybody else, also has these rules about we need to see a market maker may quote no less than this. They need to refresh. They need to send out orders. They need to do all these types of things. So it does exist, but we don't refer to it in the same way. I would say, this is my opinion, it's generally because all of these exchanges are set up in a place that is very well policed. If we're talking about the United States, Canada, Western Europe, these markets are very well policed. So even in these volumes happening, we say, well, that's happening because we want to make sure that there's constant connectivity. And if nothing happens for a little while, that doesn't really reassure people that, the market makers are actually there. Now, if I do want to trade into a market maker in those things, I know that there's depth. I can see it. It doesn't just disappear. That isn't necessarily the case inside of something like a cryptocurrency exchange. Particularly in the US, we have things called speed bumps. If I put out an order, I need to leave it there for some amount of time. It's blazingly fast. It's fractions of a second, but I have to leave it out there for that amount of time. In a cryptocurrency exchange, generally, unless there's some kind of failure, I can pull that out and put it in whenever I want. So the whole order book can just disappear instantly. That is something that generally wouldn't be allowed in a more regulated market. It does exist in some of the frontier markets, as we've referred to them in the capital markets, where they don't have that same kind of speed bump thing.
Like pink sheets?
No, so this would be generally different countries. So this could be Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia.
Right. Okay. We're talking about those minor stock exchanges that exist throughout, like the Seychelles Stock Exchange.
It could be much larger than that. We could be talking about, the UAE, Saudi Arabia would fit into those types of buckets. Until recently, they didn't have all these things in some very large stock exchanges in East Asia. Places like Singapore really only recently put in the same level of rules that you would see in a place like Japan.
Interesting. Okay.
Do you have anything else on this? Otherwise, I was going to toss it to NFTs.
Yeah, so we were talking about wash trading in Tether. So that's one I wanted to hit on. So I only want to hit on a fraction of it because I know you guys talk about this a lot. Tether is miles and miles deep. Particularly on the wash trading thing. A lot of people look at, the number of Tether outstanding and they look at the volume and they say, well, how does this happen that, I don't even know what the number of Tether is. I'm going to say 100 billion Tether in existence. I'm probably not that far off, am I?
Not yet. You're close, but not yet.
It's like 80 something, yeah.
I'm going to say 100 billion because it's a nice round number. And there's 250 billion in volume. This just isn't possible. What they forget to say is, these trades can happen all the time. And it can be legitimate flow going through this where I'm buying and selling legitimately. And I trade my single one Tether 500 times in a day. This happens a lot. And these are not necessarily wash trades. It could be because I'm actually trading against somebody that wants to buy or sell Bitcoin versus Tether all day long. And that's my business. I'm a market maker or I'm just a trader and I'm actively trading. So that alone doesn't, to me, prove wash trading. And I'm not saying that wash trading isn't a component of this, but that metric alone is something that is slightly different.
You're talking about velocity of money.
Velocity of money, yeah. So a lot of people point this out and they say, oh, that's not possible because they completely forget velocity of money. Now, would I wash trade Tether for Tether's sake? I can't see a ton of reasons why you would do it, especially in this market right now. People have brought this up, particularly when we have market downturns in 2018, 2019 style, where there is just less stuff happening and they want to show the exchanges are moving. I think there was a famous piece about Kraken and volumes on Tether to USD because they did have that pair. But now a lot of these pairs are kind of minor and they don't always exist in the same exchanges. But if we see something like... if I see $1 million traded between Bitcoin USDT or half that traded between Ether and USDT on the same exchange, I would consider them generally probably 80-90% quote unquote legitimate trades. And that would massively push up the numbers that we would see in something like Tether. And that's just because a lot of these traders are trading on very low fees and they're trying to capture a small spread and trading maybe across a couple of different exchanges using trading bots.
I do want to say that when I was talking about velocity of money back in the day, I think I did a piece on it as well. But when I was talking about it with Tether, the numbers that we were seeing for the velocity of money, and again, Colin did a good job of explaining this, but I just want to say for anyone who is lost on this, that velocity of money is just how many times a single dollar bill would trade hands in a given period of time. So the more times it trades hands, the higher the velocity of money. At the time that I was following Tether adamantly, the velocity of the money for Tether was something like 1,000%. Like it was something totally insane. Like that does not happen in normal markets at all. Like when you look at all other stable coins, the velocity of those other stable coins would be something in the range of like 50 to 80%. And I just checked right now, and lo and behold, Tether is at 76% velocity. So it is within the range of like normal velocity now, which does point to the fact that, like you said, it seems like wash trading is less of an issue now than it used to be.
I think that's probably a fair assessment, Cass. And I think, well, a lot of things have changed in 2018. For one thing, the market is more liquid now in 2022 than in 2018. And so there's a lot less reason to try to fake things, and you're a lot more likely to have to be outed as trying to fake things. So like back in 2018, when you'd look at like the Tether numbers, they were frequently absurd, but they were often dominated by CoinMarketCap reporting Bit4x having 10 times the volume of Bitfinex, right? And other crazy stuff like that, where the numbers being reported by the exchange were clearly not being driven by organic or meaningful flow. And like you mentioned, the Matt Leising piece on Kraken's trading of the Tether pair, where he suggested that he thought there was evidence of wash trading because it stayed so close to $1. And of course, the response to that is always you'd see the same mechanism if Tether is actively redeeming and people are willing to try to arbitrage the peg, right? Like trying to look for trades at a specific dollar amount on a pegged asset is probably not the cleanest way to find wash trading, because you expect the pegged asset to be worth what it's pegged at. Like that's what it should do.
Plus or minus a risk discount or some other kind of premium.
Yeah, or a demand premium if it's more valuable to have that than the corresponding dollar. And so like you expect it to be pretty damn tight. And so I agree with you that is not sufficient evidence on its face of like a group acting maliciously for Tether's benefit, like to do the wash trading to defend Tether.
Yeah, it's a bit like in the traditional markets. Something that often gets quoted is looking at futures or ETFs on gold. And it's actually funny because a few years ago, and I stopped kind of following it actively, but there was a lot of scandals about these big gold vaults in China possibly not having all the gold that they claim to have. And a lot of these futures and ETFs were built off of the notion that it was there.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, it was a huge scandal. I don't know what happened in the end, whether they figured out where it was or it got reconciled, I don't know. But there were entire derivatives products that were built off of this that had insane volumes off the notion that this gold was sitting in a vault and you could somehow maybe redeem against it. And that wasn't even always a promise, particularly with futures and particularly with China, where you have a lot of non-deliverable financial products. And non-deliverable financial products are super normal. They happen everywhere. In the United States, they happen to be some of the bigger products, particularly when we talk about financial products or some of the commodities. Like I was looking at cheese, you can't, or dairy, you can't actually take the underlying because of some rule. The gold didn't physically need to move, but you could still have this really high volume that didn't really speak to the velocity of it or even the redeemability of it. Again, I'm not going to get into that on Tether. You guys have covered that with people that are much more knowledgeable than I am, but just to kind of bring up one of those weird financial factoids.
And I mean, even in the mortgage-backed security crisis, we ended up with CDOs dwarfing the size of CDSs, dwarfing the size of mortgage-backed bonds. As you go up the levels of derivative, you end up with higher nominal volumes and dollar amounts being thrown around.
Yeah, it's easier to deal with those types of things than it is to deal with the underlying.
This is actually a good segue because we're talking about liquidity issues. We're talking about wash trading. We're talking about all this stuff that was, at least before, quite evident in the cryptocurrency markets. But Colin, you're like a big fan of NFTs.
I love the JPEGs, man.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that Bennett and I don't think we hate NFTs as much as people probably think we do. It's not like we plan on ever buying them, but I don't think we hate them as much as everyone would suspect we hate them. But what do you think we're missing? And what do you think we disagree with about this stuff with you?
Okay, well, let's take it back, and then we can have a discussion about that. So let me define, why I think NFTs are interesting. Let's start there. One of the things that was really interesting to watch in the fungible crypto community, particularly happening from 2017 onwards when these things started to get popular, it did happen before. You had a lot of people that invested money into these and became part of a community. And the joke was, you either traded and made money or you lost money and you became part of a community. You became a community member. So it was, lovingly referred to as a bag holder self-help group. When you get onto these Telegram, everybody, oh yeah, this thing's going to break out imminently and go to the moon and all this. And it's there's a lot of hopium. But what did actually happen out of this is you do have a lot of people that, started to make friends with other people and started to talk about their favorite token and their favorite project and get to know each other. You guys, very different, but started to get to know each other, I guess, through a token. In a way, but it's created lots of different communities. I'm not wrong, that exist outside of the pure speculating on this thing. Now, where NFTs kind of come into this is a lot of people can have a financial motive, but a lot of what you really see in this NFT investment or coming into these things is people actively looking for a community, a way to relate with people on some kind of common manner, whereas they may have nothing else in common with them. PFPs, profile picture, NFTs are really at the forefront of this. So people go, I've got my ape or I've got penguins. I love penguins. But you kind of bond with people that are working in the industry or involved in the industry. And people have started to form different groups talking about things that have nothing to do with crypto. I saw somebody putting up, they were running a whole thing about how to use Photoshop because it was somebody that knew how to use Photoshop really well. And they taught people that had penguin PFPs how to use it. Obviously, it's much more open than this, but they're flushing this thing through the Discord. People are talking, when they go to conferences, they meet up, we need to get an Airbnb together. Okay, I'll go into my Discord and get an Airbnb with somebody else that has a Bored Ape. It's created a community that can exist in the real world. And I think given kind of their rise to popularity in 2028, kind of fit in with the whole COVID thing going on where people weren't leaving and they wanted to connect with the outside world. I think that's quite interesting. Now, that doesn't mean that they're perfect and beyond reproach, but I do think that that's an interesting dynamic.
Well, I do want to say two things there. One, a good friend of mine, and I think you probably follow him too, at Eat Cook Cryptos, Majin's uncle. Mm-hmm. He's awesome, and we bonded over hot sauce. Like that is our initial bond, was him like showing off his food and his hot sauce that he makes, and me being like, I want hot sauce, give me hot sauce. So I think that before NFTs, whether or not we're arguing about Tether or talking about Bitcoin or talking about smart contracts, there's been people who have always been seeking out, like, yeah, I'm just also looking for people to talk to about food or talk to about motorcycles or whatever, right? I mean, I think that's long existed outside of the NFT space. But I recently, I think people probably assumed it was just simply a joke. But the way I think about NFTs is that I collect dumb Canadian shitcoins. I collect physical Canadian shitcoins, and they're very stupid. Like, there's no denying how stupid it is. My most recent purchase is for 30 Canadian dollar coin. I paid like $100 for it. What the fuck is wrong with me, right? I get that. I get that that is like, okay, so clearly I'm buying something that is not actually as valuable as it's suggested, and it's because I think it's fun and cool, and that's it. That's like my explanation. There's no there's no like actual explanation outside of, I guess I'm speculating and having fun speculating on a little pretty thing. Do you think that's like a pretty good summation of what NFTs represent?
I think it's very much like that. The thing I like to compare NFT communities with is a country club. I go in and I buy a spot in a country club by buying this NFT and showing off that I'm part of this country club. And some country clubs are relatively inexpensive to get in. People want to join the country club or the golf club or whatever you're into, because there's a utility access to it, and maybe I meet my neighbors and my friends. There's some other ones that are very exclusive and very, very expensive. And the reason I want to join it is because I will meet people that are considered higher on the social scale than me. I meet CEOs. And those will cost 10 times as much. NFTs have the same breakdown. I'm going to go ahead and guess people that collect coins probably fall into different buckets. I collected coins when I was young, and I have weird pennies from, the 1920s. Those probably are worth a whole lot less than your brand new spanking, mint Canadian stuff.
I doubt it. I don't think mine are anything special either.
Cass is not an investor.
No.
He is a community member.
They're certainly more expensive than the pennies that I collected. But, you bond with people over these things. And, as humans, we need to bond with people, and we do it over a variety of things. It could be, Canadian coins. It could be JPEGs. It could be Ferraris. It could be country clubs. Whatever it is, you're seeking to mingle with people in what's perceived as a group with a common interest. And sometimes it can be aspirational, and I'm willing to pay up for it. One of the things that I would say is probably applies to your coins more than my country club or a Ferrari, is there is an expectation that, when I'm done with this community or whatever, I can sell my seat in the community. I can sell all of my Canadian coins and go, buy other coins or whatever, or I can sell my NFT. Now, that does give us, of course, a profit motive, and you can say this is good, this is bad, whatever. But that is one of the key differences between the pure country club or people collecting, I don't know, whatever has zero resale value and no assumption of speculation inside of it. I wouldn't even put in, pogs or anything like that in there. But, I guess when we were young, we probably didn't try to sell pogs on a secondary market. We did trade them with each other, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we should have probably tried to sell them, but now they're just sitting somewhere.
They're probably worth a lot of money now. I don't know.
I doubt it. I doubt it.
Yeah, most collectibles aren't.
Yeah.
So part of my struggle with NFTs and like the more community-focused DAOs, which is what they're calling themselves, whatever. I can understand joining a community around a common interest. Like Cass and I originally bonded over Tether, and then coffee, and then food, and then and I play Dungeons and Dragons and have made friends playing this weird imaginary game. And so my ability to criticize people for doing weird and imaginary things is limited.
Tell me about JPEGs.
But like, I guess when I look at something like the largest NFTs, like a Bored Ape or a CryptoPunk or something like that, I don't understand what interest ties together a group of Bored Ape Yacht Club holders, or what interest ties together a group of CryptoPunk holders, besides a belief in value accrual to profile picture NFTs.
Yeah, so, I mean, look, no denying it, that is a big undertone that people speculate on it, and that does tie people together. That does foster some of the early communities. I think within something like a Bored Apes, I'm not in the Bored Ape community, but there are a lot of VCs and there are a lot of people that are in that circle. They're very famous people that have some of these. Not all of it is legitimate. I know that that's been pointed out, but there are people that do actively participate in this community. And by being in the same Discord as them, you as, the lonely Bored Ape holder that got in very early but otherwise has no claim to fame, is speaking to them on the same level. What do they talk about? Well, there's lots of different things, and they do have real in-life gathering. You remember the famous video in New York at NFT New York, which was quite cringe. But obviously these people do enjoy getting together and being with each other in real life as they do on Discord or in other mediums. There's also the whole thing about, to the extent it matters, lots of people see, okay, this Bored Ape wrote something on Twitter, I'm going to focus on that tweet, I'm going to like it, I'm going to retweet it, whatever it is that you might not do if somebody isn't in your community. Again, stupid internet points, but these are the types of things that we have been taught as a population mean something to us. Like you like to put out a tweet and have more retweets on it, right? That feels good. Is it worth the price of a house to have that? Probably not. But these are the types of things that form around the community. Lots of these other ones, you do have some that are more focused on entrepreneurship. There's one that I'm involved with that happens to have a lot of people in Silicon Valley who are doing startups at different variations. And that you can go in there and you say, hey, do you know somebody that does this? Or I'm hiring somebody that does this. And it's just a very good form to do that. Do you need to have an NFT? No. But it's kind of I don't want to say shilling point, but it's kind of a common area that people know that they can come to. And if they see this out there, they know, okay, there's a good chance that I can go talk to them. And I live in France. I went to a French business school. Similar things exist in other countries in the US, but there are very few business schools in France. And I know that if somebody went to the same business school as me, even if they went 20 years before I went there, I can send them an email and 9 out of 10 times they will respond to me. I guess people at Harvard probably have a similar thing. I would assume. I don't know. I didn't go to Harvard. But that is the dynamic you have here. That cost a lot of money to go to business school, right? And it costs a lot of money to go to someplace like Harvard. If you put in the price of pulling Bored Apes away, some of these NFTs that cost $10,000, and I know that there are people in there that are successful investors or successful entrepreneurs, and I can access them for that price. And there's a pretty good chance that I can resell it for about what I paid, slightly more, slightly less, whatever. For a lot of people, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we can talk about money games. We can talk about how realistic any of this is. And, I live in a small town, and I was thinking about this before I called you, where people do real things, and talking about these intangible things makes no sense to anybody around here. I mean, people fish. Like, that's the job you do around here. You fish or you build boats. Like, that's it. And I lived in London before, and I worked in banking. I lived in New York, and I worked in banking. And you talk about these intangible things, and it clicks. It makes sense. Saying, oh, yeah, I spent $50,000 to join this NFT community because I wanted to chat with this guy. I got his contact, great, and then I sold it on to the next sucker that wants to do the same thing. Like, that doesn't seem as stupid as it just sounded coming out of my mouth, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're making an interesting point, but I do think that there's a few issues that I think about when you talk about this stuff. Like, for instance, we had Mooncat on, and she talked about how the whole concept of like how the meet and greets for celebrities are generally priced low enough or something so that at least some people who aren't hyper wealthy can still meet people like Britney Spears or whatever, and how this seems to be pricing these people out, and how this seems to be like a way for people to interact with their fans, for instance, and price out the poors and make it so like only the rich people get to interact with them. And I think there's some truth to that, perhaps. And I also think you're talking about this club and the positives of like being in this club and stuff like that, but we should talk about the negatives, which are quite apparent on Twitter, where we're constantly seeing people go like, my Bored Ape is gone now, or shit, I lost my Bored Ape, or oh, I got hacked, or whatever. And it happens like almost.
Are CryptoPunks actually smarter and better at OPSEC, or are they just smart enough not to say anything?
That's a good question.
But I'm wondering what your response to these kind of like negative aspects are.
Yeah. So, okay, let me attack your question about punks. Are they better at OPSEC? I would ask that not only of the NFT communities, are people that hold Bitcoin that, accidentally screw up and give out, or Ether, whatever it is, and accidentally screw up and give out $500,000 because they typed in their password and get robbed. You see it a lot less now because the Bitcoin community, for all of their faults, is very focused on teaching each other how to do better OPSEC. But I remember seeing tons of that, people going, oh, I just lost $500,000, or I know people that DeFi summer that were out getting rugged because they were putting all this money into unaudited contracts and losing millions and millions of dollars every day because somebody put a backdoor into their contract and didn't verify it. Nobody thought to even look. Or they did, and they didn't know what they were doing. This happens all over the place. It is bad that it happens. We're laughing about it now, but there is real financial loss from this, and it is very unfortunate. I would say that for a lot of people, the NFT experience is their first foray into crypto. They probably went in and put their first, whatever money they put in on Coinbase with a credit card or a bank transfer, immediately took it out, went in and bought on OpenSea a Bored Ape or whatever, generally when the price was significantly lower. I don't imagine that there's a lot of people that come in first time and spend $250,000 to buy a Bored Ape. I'm sure it has happened, but I think a lot of it was back when these things were, a few $1,000s maybe, and they said, hey, I'll take a gamble and spend a few $1,000s and not go to Vegas for the weekend or whatever. Now, because it's their first time in, and because your only experience maybe was trading a little bit on Coinbase, you didn't learn a lot of these things. Now, I'm not singling out the Bored Ape community as being bad, but there are, as we've seen, a lot of people in that community who become quite widely known, possibly because of this effect of being in this objectively very successful project. So being higher profile than some of the other ones. But I'm sure it happens in, random green frog NFT number 413. We just don't see it to the same extent. Or if it does happen and they broadcast it, well, they only have 3 followers, so nobody knows. Nobody picks up on these things. There are some that tend to be older, and I'm going to come back to something you said about being priced out. Things like punks. Punks tend to skew more towards the people that have been around NFTs for a while. And I think that the way that punks were launched, it was really never launched, to my understanding, as the idea to be a PFP. It was just an experiment. It was fun. Somebody put it out there and they said, hey, we can do this, just like we had CryptoKitties.
And the first time they put it out there, it got all fucked up and they had to put it out there a second time. The version 1 contract had some weird bug in it.
Exactly. Yeah. And you could have infinite mints on these things. But it was just kind of that stepping stone. And when we did kind of solidify these things and we had V2, even for a long time before it got popular, you had people that had been around the cryptocurrency space and said, hey, this is kind of fun. I'm going to use this for my Twitter profile picture. You should do the same thing because you've got one of those. And it just kind of naturally evolved. And they, by happenstance or whatever, had 10,000 of these things that existed. And 10,000 is quite a small number, especially when they're worth very little and people can acquire dozens or hundreds of these things. That really reduces the number of hands that can have them. Now, everybody is doing a similar number of mints of, mid 4 digits to low 5-digit numbers of mints, mostly because of the fact that that's what punks did. Now, there are lots of them that have started to look and kind of coming back to your being priced out of these things. There are attempts to kind of expand this where a project wants to do something more than just mint and earn off the mint and maybe some royalties for a few weeks. And they're thinking, okay, well, I want to be something that's accessible and I want the worth of these things to be somewhere between, let's say, $100 and $1,000. Like, I'm just going to say that that's the market that they want to attract. How many of these things do I need to put out? Do I need to have a fixed number? Do I need to have an expanding number? If we look at things like games, maybe they look to target a market where an asset's worth $5 and $100, and maybe I need to adjust how many can exist. Maybe they can be burnt, maybe they can be minted, depending on what's going on. But I do want to have some aspects of these things that are somewhat controlled. And I think those projects will be very successful. Will they aim towards where we're going? Currently, I'd say probably not, but they will be thought out by marketing teams rather than an artist and a dev. They get together and go, hey, we know this thing works. We know we can make money. Let's just launch it and see what happens. And most of them fail, but obviously not all of them.
So you mentioned you don't know that those will be where you think we're going. Where do you think we're going? What's the end state? Or the next state, at least?
I wouldn't say that I definitely have answers or that this would even be a full picture of the market, but I think things that are evolving are quite interesting is using NFTs within different games. I think the PFP community will exist, whether it'll refine down into fewer different collections that have higher numbers, I don't know. But I think that there is clearly a desire to have them. Where I'm personally very focused is within SVGs or scalable vector graphics being built directly into the NFT. So Loot was kind of one of the ones that popularized this. This was its own little fad for like...
Doesn't Uniswap use an SVG for their ERC721?
Uniswap V3 does this as well. So I personally think it's quite cool because most NFTs, the images that we see, the JPEGs, tend to live either on a centralized server someplace, maybe it's AWS, or an IPFS, which is kind of in the middle, or some other solution. but it's definitely not on the blockchain. And what that means, pulling aside anything about immutability and all that great stuff, but my smart contract cannot actually interact with this. Somebody outside needs to update these things, change them, whatever, and pass in a new image that I now see on OpenSea or in my wallet. With things that are on chain, I can go and I can poke them with a smart contract transaction. So the idea of having things that evolve and do different things or can be picked up by different contracts is quite interesting. And especially if we pull it out of the Ethereum mainnet focus into some of these alternative L1s or L2s, transactions become cheap enough that I can actually interact with these things on a regular basis. And I think that that will open the door to say, what other things can we do with NFTs where it's not solely about the image on it. We want to create something more. And maybe that's extrapolated into different layers that may have nothing to do with the blockchain, but we still have this kind of base asset that we can come back to. We can pull apart, we can share, we can put into a DAO and vote about what happens with it, whatever you want to do. But it starts to become a building block rather than the end state, which we currently view something like a PFP as.
So what you see as the next evolution is NFTs that
are more interactive.
Well, it sounds almost like in many respects they'd be small smart contracts themselves with configurable parameters that can be called by whitelisted wallets or stuff to change parameters, to change features of these NFTs. Is that what you're describing? Just make sure I understand.
Yeah, basically. So think about it, as 2017 ICOs were to DeFi, I think PFPs will be to whatever comes next in NFTs. So being able to do things that are more interesting than just speculating on the price going up and down or setting them as your Twitter profile picture.
There's so many people who are putting forth use cases that I just don't get, though. Like, there's a lot of people saying stuff like, it'll change ticketing forever. And I'm like, why?
I just bought a ticket for the ECC conference in Paris in July, and they use this NFT platform. And it was just an awful experience to use it. And I would wish that on no one. They tried, like, to their credit, but, like, there's all kinds of problems with it and maybe some teething problems. But I agree with you. And I first got involved in crypto in 2014 and 2015. And I worked at a bank. And, of course, banks all wanted to talk about blockchains at the time. And I remember reading these articles, and it was the common joke, can blockchain solve X? And of course it could solve whatever, it could cure cancer, it could, alleviate poverty, it could solve, wars amongst countries, whatever it was. Actually, people are still talking about that. But there are a lot of people that don't understand what they're talking about and have no subject matter expertise. And they're thinkfluencers or whatever they are. And we listen to them for some reason about things that are highly technical and highly complex or very limited in what they can deliver. And I think, David Gerard, you guys had on, he was very active during the blockchain time saying, well, this thing is just functionally a linked list, right? And if you just want to put a blockchain in there, you want to put a linked list in there, you're not actually changing the problem. The problems you have are bigger and outside of that. It's not how you save data. And I would say the same thing about NFTs. I remember you were criticizing not too long ago people saying, oh yeah, you can put words and journalism inside of NFTs. And things that just have no grounding in reality. Like, how does that change anything?
Yeah.
Which I think in a sense almost connects us back to some of the ICO culture problems that PTK was trying to point out. A lot of people turn to ICOs not as a technical solution, but because it offered this really easy way to get immediate liquidity, to get this investment, to get this liquidity, to be able to sell these things and have a secondary market for these things without having to build it yourself. So you hear people say things like NFTs will be great for tickets, not because it solves any of the inherent ticketing related questions, but because it makes it easy for people to sell their tickets. And I think that's even in some sense consistent, Colin, with what you were describing as one of the advantages of NFTs for this kind of community thing, is that you are effectively purchasing a seat at the table of this community. And when you no longer want to be a part of it, there's already a way for you to sell that and leave without there having to be the more messy human processes if you're having to negotiate with other people to figure out how to do that. And so a lot of times our criticisms around blockchain, NFTs, DAOs, and all these things is the technical solution you're using isn't solving any of the problems you claim you have, because the problems they're claiming they have are not the problems they actually want to solve. Like, many of the ICOs weren't interested in using blockchain to solve a problem. They were interested in creating a resaleable token.
I would even go, I would assume, okay, you're definitely absolutely right for a very large number of ICOs. But I think that there were a lot of projects who And I see this, I have calls with people all the time that want to ask me about NFTs. There are a lot of projects that shoehorn a token, whether it's an NFT or fungible token, in there because they have an idea that they truly believe in, and they need to raise money to execute on this idea. And they find a way to make the NFT or the blockchain or whatever it is fit into what they're doing, even if it's not necessary. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this is an act of bad faith. I might be trying to build I'm just going to pick, random, because I was talking about it earlier, random fisherman down here needs to buy a new boat. So he's going to tokenize and make a DAO out of his boat because he knows that he can raise the money. Do I need a token representing ownership of the boat down here that the fisherman is using? Absolutely not. But he knows if he goes to the bank, they're going to spend weeks and weeks and weeks, and maybe they'll loan him money, whereas he knows he can go to the crowd and get this money. And I think something that often is overlooked, back in 2017 and 2018 when we had ICOs, in places like China, we also had the explosion of crowdfunding. And that wasn't something that was really popular in the US to the same extent as places like Europe and Asia. But crowdfunding, going out, raising $5 from a million different people was really, really popular. And I think that that's something that ICOs are just another extension of, albeit with less regulation. And NFTs are another way to do that. Again, you're right, it's not necessary, but it does raise money.
I will certainly concede it's not necessarily bad faith, but in the vast majority of cases, I can recall reading at least some point in their white paper documentation or marketing materials, they lie about what the thing is capable of doing. And so as soon as they do that, I dump it in the bad faith bucket.
Oh, yeah, and that's very fair.
Like, I understand why they do it, but...
Well, I want to say that you're talking about crowdfunding projects, and if you want to talk about an industry rife with fraud, I think look no further than crowdfunding projects. To me, if I go right now and look at the list of highest funded crowdfunded projects, EOS, top of the list. I think we can all agree that is at least
There's a lot of crossover between crowdfunding and tokens, right?
Yeah. At best, EOS is a sorry attempt at trying to create a new blockchain. At worst, it was definitely a cash grab. So I think there's that's number one. But then number two, you have Star Citizen. Number three, Filecoin. Number four, Tezos. Number five, the DAO.
The DAO was great, by the way.
Yeah, that worked out really well. But we can look outside of the blockchain things, which are all showing up here and have done miserable. I don't even know what this is. Status? What's Status? Do you guys remember Status?
Status, it rings a bell, yes.
It raised $103 million.
Status.im, right?
Elio Motors. It's scams up and down as far as I'm concerned. Not to call none of these. I'm not actually expressing that any of these are scams. But as far as I'm concerned, these all sound bad. And I'm just wondering, so if we're trying to fix it, how is blockchain going to help fix what is obviously a problematic industry?
Okay, so let me break it into two parts here. A basic tenet in modern finance and banking is that money will flow to where it's cheapest, right? This is exactly why central banks lower interest rates. They want to stimulate credit. They want people to go out and spend money, right? You have the same thing that exists of raising money from public markets. If I know that all I need to do is put up a 3-page white paper and I can raise $500,000 to accomplish whatever I'm trying to accomplish, assuming I'm trying to accomplish something that isn't just outright fraud, I want to take your money and deliver you nothing. That is one bucket, right? But there are people that are trying to do something, and this is what I was saying, where I would argue with the faith. They're trying to create something and they believe in what they're trying to do, and it is an honest attempt. It may be a flawed attempt and it may be doomed to failure, but I, as somebody that needs to go out and raise $500,000 to see my vision out, and I work every waking moment trying to accomplish this vision, even if it's never going to take off because I'm trying to, make a condom for a dolphin. I don't know. Something stupid. It doesn't mean that using crowdfunding is a bad idea or is directly fraudulent. It's just a dumb idea. And I went to the easiest place that I know if I could get money. And I would have gone to the bank or, borrowed it from my friends and family if they gave me the money, right? It's just there. It's just a dumb idea that happens to use the easiest available means. Now, coming back into the second part of it, how does a blockchain solve, my new business of putting condoms on a dolphin? I have no idea, but there are people out there that can put together things that they maybe heard from somebody else that didn't understand the blockchain, and through Chinese whispers, I need to put some kind of provenance technology on the latex when it came out of Malaysia before it got put on the dolphin. I don't know, But there are people out there that definitely want to do that, and that adds some kind of value, and it makes the product at least make sense to the other people that are willing to put their hard-earned money into my business of putting condoms on dolphins.
It's unfortunate that so many people want to put condoms on dolphins.
This can't be good for the dolphin populations.
Yeah, I thought they were endangered.
Colin, why do you hate the dolphins?
Yeah. Why do so many blockchainers want to support this project? I'm so mad right now. I mean, honestly, Colin, I wish that we had more coiners like you. I just think that there aren't, I think, as many as you would suggest there are that acknowledge that a lot of this is just pure hype and speculation, and that's kind of the fun part. Like, if more people were willing to admit that, I think BT and I would have a lot less of a problem with a lot of people.
So it's my job to go out and convince everybody to tell you that they think that the hype is the fun part.
It'll make our life easier.
You know, I do have a good solution to how we do this. We're going to set up a DAO. We're going to issue a token. And we'll use all the money for advocacy, of course.
Thank you for joining us, Colin. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to throw out there before we call it, but
just buy PTK.
Yeah, good luck finding it.
I wonder if I'm even still able to access the wallet.
Well, that's classic. You and Josh and everyone else always seems to lose the wallet keys of the scam that you've created. But hey, whatever. I get it.
It's an unfortunate boating accident.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But I do appreciate you joining us. I think everyone probably knows, if they follow me on Twitter, you did promise me a baguette as payment for this. And in DMs, you did say 4.
I'm glad you disclosed that. It's good and fair of you.
Yeah, you disclosed.
So come right out to France, and I will make sure that you were delivered, with baguettes all you want for the entire time you're here.
It's a deal, and now people understand that we do accept payments for guests to come on, but they're usually it's gonna have to be food-related payments. So yeah, thank you, thanks again, Colin, and what a joy to have you. So thank you.
You're gonna have to watch out now because people are gonna want to advertise and actually send you caviar and champagne, right?
Hey, I'm not gonna say no to You also might not get. I'm not confirming for anybody that if you send us food, you're getting on the podcast, but it wouldn't hurt. So go ahead and send it. I mean, we'll gladly accept food.
If you're like a ICO who thinks that sending us caviar and champagne to get on the show is going to result in an episode that makes you look good and brings in new investors, you might want to reassess your priors.
And send the stuff. Go ahead and send it anyway.